Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're looking at the later Hasmonean period as we continue our study of the time between the Testaments. We left off, we had seen John Hyrcanus and his sons did not play nicely together. Aristobulus, after having um, arrested his siblings, had imprisoned them and had a wife by the name of Alexandra, but then he died. And so in that Liverite marriage, remember that she first released the siblings of her husband, and then she took Alexander Jannaeus as her husband, so that they might have children together because there had been no children in that previous marriage. So Alexander Jannaeus, he eventually dies, not before he has gone through a Jewish civil war, pitting the Pharisees against the Sadducees, and he had been on the Sadducee side. But now she comes to the throne, and even though her children are adults, you have Hyrcanus the second and Aristobulus the second. They are both in their 20s, and yet she does not step aside for her son. The oldest son was Hyrcanus II, but instead, when he dies in the year 76 BC, she takes the throne now as the queen. The idea of having a Jewish queen that is ruling, well, that hadn't been done since the days of Athaliah back in the Old Testament, and she had not been a hero. She had been the villain of the story. Remember, who had come on the scene and had tried to eliminate the Davidic line of children. Well, Alexandra is not going to do anything like that, but she comes on the scene and she will take Hyrcanus, even though he's already in his 20s. She will say, "You're going to be the high priest, but you're not going to be the king. I'm going to be the queen, and I am running things." And Hyrcanus, he's okay with that. He doesn't seem to have that drive where he has to be in charge, and I don't want to say he's necessarily a mama's boy, but he's going to go along with that. Now Aristobulus, let me just say, Aristobulus II, he's cut of a very different cloth. He can't wait to be in charge, and he's going to be pulling strings both behind the scenes and in front of the scenes to try to make that happen. But for the time being, she is the one who's in charge, and he just has to take a back seat. So she's going to reign from 76 to 67 BC, 9 years. Her brother is Simeon ben Shetach, a respected Pharisee. And remember, her husband had not been friendly toward the Pharisees. And yet she is, what her personal beliefs are, I don't know. But she's going to favor her brother. And so he's going to be taken out. And in the past, the Pharisees had either gotten out of town or in some cases been crucified. It had been very terrible against them. Well, she takes a Pharisee, not her brother, but a Pharisee, and makes him the head of the Sanhedrin. Normally, it would be the high priest who would be traditionally the head of the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is the supreme court of Israel. Well, she makes a Pharisee the head, and then her brother Simeon is going to be the vice chair, the sort of the just how we have a vice president. He would be the one behind the head, and the one that she appoints he's an older man, and he dies a year or so later, and then Simeon, her brother, becomes the new head of the Sanhedrin. Well, like I said, her brother's eventually given this role. Now, let's go back and review a bit about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They have two different belief systems as well as two different political stances, which had led the Pharisees afoul. Remember, they had been saying it's just not right for the same person to be king and priest, and they had made a bit of a stink about that, which had set them on the bad side of the monarchy. Well, the word Pharisee means the separated ones, and they saw themselves as separated out from the general consensus of Jewish people, where they're going to be a cut above in the way they keep the law, not just the written law, but the oral law as well. We'll see what that means. The Sadducees, the term actually means righteous ones. Didn't mean they were righteous. Didn't mean they were any more righteous than anyone else. But they were following they tended to be strong in the priesthood. But remember, they're not necessarily following the Zadok priesthood that had been largely abandoned by them. So you say, how righteous are they? Well, they're in the temple, and they are heavily represented among the priesthood. The Pharisees held to the authority of the entire Old Testament as well as the oral law, and they would hold to both of those with the same tenacity. In fact, later Pharisees, I'm not sure if they were already saying this at this time, but later Pharisees would say that Moses gave not just the written law, but he also gave the traditions, the oral law as well. And so they gave it the same weight. Now, the Sadducees viewed the oral law as having the greater authority, the Torah as having the greater authority, not the oral law. They didn't think the oral law had much weight at all, and so if somebody broke the oral law, you know, they just sniffed and said, "Well, that's fine. That's not a problem." Um, in seeing the oral law as having greater authority, that's going to lead to some differing belief systems, and then some of the differing belief systems won't even be really based on that. The Pharisees believed in miracles and angels and immortality, things that were found in the Old Testament as well as in their tradition. The Sadducees denied these things, miracles, angels, immortality, and yet the oral law, well, you can't read it. You can see miracles there in the oral law. You'll see angels. Um, they would say, well, you don't see immortality there, but Jesus is going to correct them on that point. And when Jesus comes along, he's going to say, when Moses in the written law, when he first meets God, God says to him, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He doesn't say, I used to be their God back when they were alive. So Jesus would say, if you read the written law carefully, now let me just confess, I would have missed that. Uh, but Jesus points it out, and I agree with Jesus, that he points out that when you read the written law carefully, you will see the idea of immortality, of life after death. The Pharisees believed in a future resurrection, and the Sadducees denied that this is all there is, so you might as well get what you're going to get. And yet they did worship God. They felt that the observances in the temple were important. The Pharisees became very popular in the synagogues, especially when people saw how they had suffered. That's what we went through in the last class. How they had suffered for their sins. The Sadducees are going to rule the temple. Even in the upcoming period, when there's going to be a reversal of fortunes, you will still continue to see the Sadducees mostly. They'll have a greater representation in the temple. The Pharisees they have friends. I'm not sure if I could say they are represented by, but Salome Alexandra, her brother is a Pharisee, and so she's going to be very friendly toward the Pharisees, which means that the persecutions, as soon as she is queen and her husband has died, the persecutions against the Pharisees end completely. In fact, they go from being a persecuted people to having a favored status. And her son Hyrcanus II is going to go along with that, and they're going to go along with Hyrcanus, even though before they had said, well, you really need to separate the priesthood from the kingship. Um, well, it's separated now. Hyrcanus is high priest and not king, and so the Pharisees, in a sense, got what they wanted. Not necessarily the high priest that they wanted, but they'll take this one because he's friendly toward them. Meanwhile, we had already seen Alexander Jannaeus. He was the one who was crucifying Pharisees. Well, Aristobulus the first, Aristobulus the second, he's going to be cut of the same cloth. He's going to be much like that, and he won't be crucifying anyone. But we're going to see him later on coming and being in charge. The Pharisees now are in power. The Sadducees, because they are not in power, and they remember what had been done against their arch rivals, the Pharisees. Many of the Sadducees are going to decide to leave Jerusalem for the time being. It might not be healthy to be around here, although they will continue to be seen in the temple. Now, Salome Alexandra then comes to the throne 76 BC. Remember, the dates are going backwards because we're in that BC period to 67 BC. She is going to build up the military. Um, it's not that she's wanting necessarily to go to war, although there will be the occasional battle fought, but she wants to be ready, and to that end, she will also build up the fortifications within her domain. So that this period, then these 9 years, are going to be a period of relative peace and of prosperity. Things are going to actually get quite good here. She will take Damascus at one point, but she's not going to try to keep it. And so she's not going to be stepping on the toes of either the Seleucids to the north or to the Arabians to the south and to the east. So we're going to see King Aretas of Arabia in a bit. But she's getting along with everyone. She developed something of a reputation as a negotiator, as a go-between, not just herself and others, but even between different parties, where she is helping bring peace to the table. It might have been interesting to see what have happened in later years if she had reigned for a longer period than those 9 years. We come in Wars of the Jews. This is Josephus telling us a story, where at the end of those 9 years, Alexandra fell sick, and Aristobulus, her younger son, took hold of this opportunity with his domestics, of which he had a great many, who were all of them his friends. He's very popular. He's very outgoing. He's very, well, people thought of him as kingly on account of the warmth of their youth, and got possession of all the fortresses. He also used the sums of money he found in them to get together a number of mercenary soldiers, and notice what he does. He made himself king. So she gets sick, and he takes over. There's a power grab here. We continue in verse 118, it's still from the wars. Upon Hyrcanus's complaint to his mother, she had compassion for his case, that is for Hyrcanus, and put Aristobulus's wife and sons under restraint in Antonia. Antonia is a fortress in Jerusalem. It wasn't called that at this point. Notice, which was a fortress that joined to the north part of the temple. It was, as I've already said, of old called the citadel, the Baris, but later it had the name of Antonia. So same place. Later on, it's going to be built up bigger and better, but already there was a fortress on the north side of the Temple Mount. Instead, notice, but Alexandra died before she could punish Aristobulus for his disinheriting his brother, after she had reigned 9 years. So there's the term. She gets sick, she dies, and not that she intends to, but her younger son, Aristobulus, is going to be left now on the throne. So here's our lineup. We've had Alexandra. She's been ruling for the last 9 years. She dies in the year 67 BC. And the younger son, Aristobulus II, he is the one who now comes to the throne, having taken the throne from sickly mother. And Hyrcanus II, he's the oldest. He's already been serving as high priest, and he's been left out in the cold with regard to ruling the nation. And so Hyrcanus II gathers an army to challenge his younger brother, and he marches down in the direction of Jericho. Jericho, their mother had built a sort of a winter palace there. It's a nice place to be in the winter because it's like being in Florida in the winter. It's nice and warm, even though it might be snowing 18 miles away in Jerusalem. And so they had a double brothers palace, sort of a section for each one of them. And he heads down to Jericho, and as he gets down there, instead of fighting a battle, the army of Hyrcanus II deserts to his younger brother. It's like, well, that's the end of, they don't even fight a battle. And Hyrcanus II is going to be allowed to go home in peace, but he's not king, and he's not even high priest. That is actually taken from him by Aristobulus II. Now, as that takes place, remember, the high priesthood is supposed to be for life. And so the Jews see this, and they have some issues with this. Both Sadducees and Pharisees, and they all want to support the new king because let me just say, Hyrcanus II didn't really have that leadership drive. If Mom had said to Aristobulus II, "Okay, you can be king," I really think Hyrcanus II would have gone along with it, and would have been no even attempted battle. Um, but now someone comes into the picture, and he's actually not even Jewish. He's an Idumean by the name of Antipater. He's Idumean, and these are the peoples living immediately to the south of uh, of Judah, south of Jerusalem, who had been forcibly converted at an earlier age. We talked about that in a previous class. Had gone through, circumcision. That's part of conversion to Judaism, and had adopted, at least to some degree, the quote unquote Jewish faith. And he has ties, Antipater has ties to the king of Arabia, Aretas III. Arabia is that area just south, and to the south of Arabia, south of Idumea, but also to the east, the former area of Moab, to the east of the Dead Sea, and also to the south of that. Their capital is far to the south. Now, when I say Arabia, that's not Saudi Arabia today. They didn't encompass all of that area, but they did encompass the area that we think of today as southern, the kingdom of southern Jordan. That was theirs. Well, Antipater, he goes to Hyrcanus II, and he says, your brother's, he's really out to get you. He's not going to be satisfied with having just demoted you from the high priesthood. Um, there's trouble afoot, and you need to be aware. Now I think he's making this up. If Aristobulus II wanted to kill his brother, he could have done it right there in Jericho. Um, and Hyrcanus, I think, left to himself, might have just lived out his days in peace and quiet. And his brother, I think, knew his personality, and wasn't going to come up against him because he didn't see him as too much of a threat. He wasn't even a threat when he had an army behind him because they all deserted. Um, but Antipater goes to him and tries to stir up strife because Antipater himself has had some previous run-ins with Aristobulus. Antipater had been a businessman and sort of a trade negotiator, and had all sorts of dealings with both Arabia and with the Jews, and there had been an affront there somewhere. And so Antipater is doing this, I think, largely not to benefit Hyrcanus II, but to benefit Antipater. Hyrcanus II finally plays into the hands of Antipater. He hears somebody tells you, that they're out to get you, they're out to get you, they're out to get you. Eventually, you begin to believe it, and so he finally becomes convinced that the urgings of Antipater are true. That his brother Aristobulus II is going to try to have him put to death, and now he flees down to Petra. He gets down there. And sure enough, Aretas welcomes him in. And now Antipater goes to Aretas and says, "Look at what's happened to this young man. His mother had ordered that he be both high priest and king, and his younger brother dispossessed him. That's just not right. What you ought to do is make it right." And of course, there's some things here in it for you. You will have placed a king on the throne, and he will be beholden to you, and he will give you good trade networks. In Petra, the Arabs there were all about the trade network. They sat astride this conflagration of where the King's Highway and the Spice Road met, and so they would use this to really just to make a fortune on their trades and negotiating network that they had developed. And so Aretas, he likes that. He takes his army at the behest of Antipater and supposedly on behalf of Hyrcanus II, and he invades Judah. So they get up to Jerusalem, and they are being very successful. Aristobulus II is holed up in Jerusalem, not just in Jerusalem, he's holed up specifically on the Temple Mount with his Sadducees. who are largely the priesthood. And now a problem is developing. They're going to storm the Temple Mount, and in order to take it, and they're going to kill a bunch of the priests who are up there on the Temple Mount. And Hyrcanus II, uh, he had been the high priest, and he wants to be priest again. But how do you be priest when you're ended up killing a bunch of the other priests? That's not going to look good. And so we have to find a way to bring this about that will be politically correct. Well, here is where someone else comes into the story now. This is Antiquities, Josephus telling us the story. Now, there was one whose name was Onias. This is not the same Onias that we had from a previous era. This one is a righteous man, he was, and beloved of God, who in a certain drought had prayed to God to put an end to the intense heat, and whose prayers God had heard. Does that sound like anyone you know? Someone who had prayed during a drought when it hadn't rained, and God heard his prayers and had sent rain. Um, Sounds a little bit like somebody from the Old Testament. Notice he goes on, this man had hid himself because he saw that the sedition would last a great while. So somebody who had done this miracle and then had gone into hiding. That sounds a lot like the Elijah story. And so here's somebody who had acted a little bit like, in certain ways, Elijah. Well, he's in the area, and so he is fetched now to Hyrcanus II. Here's Onias, and Hyrcanus II asks that Onias will give what's called an imprecatory prayer. Your prayers are known for being very effective. You prayed and it rained, and it wasn't raining. Um, and so will you pray a prayer? An imprecatory prayer is like what you see in the Psalms once in a while, where the psalmist says, Lord, take him out, get him. uh, and Hyrcanus II asks, will you pray that sort of prayer against my brother Aristobulus II, that God gets him, that God takes him out, and then I won't have to kill a bunch of priests. I won't have to kill anyone. Let God do the dirty work. Well, Onias receives this request, and Onias doesn't want to do it. But he is urged by all that are there, and so he does offer a prayer, but his prayer, instead of being the prayer that Hyrcanus II asked for, he offers a prayer that God would not listen to either party, because both parties they've strayed from the truth. They've strayed from what they ought to be doing. And Lord, we want you to be righteous, and we want you to answer prayers in a righteous manner. Well, the Pharisees, who were backing Hyrcanus II, that's not what they wanted to hear. And so Onias is stoned to death by the Pharisees. And that's, now think about what's taking place here. And then after that, a famine comes over the land, and that famine is viewed by the people as having been the judgment of God. So think about this. An Elijah-like figure comes on the scene who withstands the king, a man of prayer, a man who falls afoul of the would-be king, and God's judgment comes on the scene. Can you see where we're about, let me do the math here, about 80, 90 years later, there's going to be another person that reminds us of Elijah, who comes on the scene, who withstands a would-be king, and who is put to death. And of course, there I'm speaking of John the Baptist. This is setting the stage for what is to come. This event is setting the stage, and people are going to remember, and they will be ready for one who will come, who will proclaim the word of the Lord, and will proclaim a future coming one.